Well, welcome once again. We're speaking with Jim Dietz, the artist and illustrator, and we've had the privilege and honor of having him before, and we're very delighted to have him today. Welcome, Mr. Dietz.
I'm delighted to be here.
All right, so we've got some work to look at and discuss and learn about your career and how you do things as well. So let's get the slideshow started, if we would. The beginning. Go back to the beginning.
As Ted Baxter said, it all started at a 40-watt station in Duluth, but Richmond, California would be good enough. You probably want to ask about early influences.
Yeah, the early influence. What made you what you are from your youth? I see a Mad magazine.
Blame, probably. Well, all of what you see here were initially what I read, which were Mad magazines and comic books and all the other effluvia of the 50s. But in artwork, I saw a lot of it at barbershops while you used to wait for a haircut, because in barbershops, they'd have everything from True magazine to the Police Gazette. And there's only so many things a kid can do while you're sitting there waiting for a haircut. And most of it was look at illustrations by some of the best illustrators and some of the worst of the 1950s. These, I'm sure you're very familiar with, is Tom Lovell's work.
Tom Lovell.
It shows up often in the Marine Corps art collection, but also was in National Geographic. And perhaps, I might be stretching this, but Lovell may have been one of the best historical illustrators that America produced, and his loss in the late 1990s was a great and tragic loss for historical art and the collecting thereof. He was with Greenwich Workshop at the time, and he was one of their best artists, although he did not produce a lot of prints. This is by Dean Cornwell, another great illustrator from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But also, these guys, very few of them have been surpassed for dynamic composition. They were well schooled, they were very quick in coming up with concepts, and their concepts, even today, ring of some sort of fidelity to both illustration and fine art.
Agreed.
Again, another Tom Lovell. If you want to see a busy illustration, this Battle of the Crater from the Civil War series is as busy as can be, and yet has a composition that is relatively simple. Whenever I've had to do a busy illustration or one with a lot of figures in it, and I bemoan the fact and sweat over it, I go, yeah, but look what Lovell did with Battle of the Crater. And it sort of, if it isn't inspiring, at least it's a kick in the butt. The thing I wanted to do when I went to art school, I had very low expectations, but I wanted to do stuff like Jack Linwood. This is one of his illustrations for Box Top.
Nice.
And he was the primo illustrator for Lovell. There were other guys like John Steele and various others who worked for different model companies. But if you were a kid in the 1950s and early 60s, you saw a lot of this artwork, and it was convincing to me in a very probably wrong-headed way that it would be possible to make a living doing this kind of work. You can imagine my father's chagrin when I came up with that. Of course, the other ones are movies. And if you know any about my work, you know how strongly it was influenced by both reality, but Dawn Patrol was one of the first movies that really had a decent story and a human story, more than simply something about airplanes. And the next one will be one that tried to focus a little towards Marine Corps stuff.
This one, I must confess, as a teenager, this was an old movie at the time. This is one of the things responsible for recruiting me into the Marine Corps, as many will probably attest.
And so, did you ever meet Riker in real life?
Well, never. There were always guys that were kind of like that, but I think they were gruffer then. There's certain things they can't do now that he did, like butt stroking Choinsky when he's doing the bayonet scene or whatever practice.
Well, I'll tell you a very short story. We had I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they had a station, Channel 2, that was not affiliated with any major network. And when they came on the air, the only thing they could play besides Three Stooges comedies were old movies. And they had most of the Warner's collection and plus a lot of others as well. And to fit into time slots, they would just chop them to pieces so that a 2-hour movie edited for commercials was usually closer to an hour and a half or an hour and 15 minutes. And sometimes they'd mix them all up. So you never knew. John Wayne could be at the end of Sands of Iwo Jima, alive. I'm not giving too much of the plot away. At any rate, when I was a very, fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, these movies would come on, and the pencil sketches or the pencil drawings I did on type paper reflected what I was watching on TV, and a number of them were generated by this or Fighting Sea Bees or Blind Tigers. So I kept up working in a very childlike way, trying to imitate what I was watching on TV, and I'm sure I'm not the only one.
College.
Art Center. Art Center is like the boot camp for artists. It was an established school that promised that if you could maintain the 8 semesters it took to get through it, that your chances of actually making money were possible. Whereas if you did it through art classes in college, it was iffy. They were a no-nonsense school that taught primarily drawing and composition. And you see a very staged shot of what was possible. This must have been, say, 70, because there's a Ford Pantera, which is about
yeah.
And one thing, I don't know that they do too much anymore, but you had numerous life drawing classes in which you were sort of learning anatomy, but also there were teachers that did setups with costume models and lighting. And at the time, I don't think I realized how important that was. I knew it was important to do relatively good drawing and painting, but because of the way those teachers taught the class, which is quietly, you learned something about setups and you learned something about composition depending on where you sat in the class. And the drawings you did and paintings were never graded, but at the end of the semester, you bring in 3 or 4 of your best ones from 15 weeks of work or however long it was, and you'd be graded on those 3 or 4 pieces. Now, in a way, we were told that when you graduated from art school, and you had a portfolio of 20 pieces, it took 10 pieces to complete one good one. So you had a 90% failure rate. And what they said a professional had, which is who you were going up against the day after you graduated, is they were going 9 for 10 were really good, and the 10th one was adequate. Oh. And that's sort of a 10,000 hour rule where you get to by the end of that.
I've got one question. Was that your hair in that scene?
No, that's Craig Nelson's hair.
Okay.
Craig was the best illustration student that I knew of.
Okay.
And he's teaching today, probably doing exactly the same thing as you see him doing here. The thing that most of us learned to endure and suffer through was called a wall crit. Oh. And a wall crit's when all your work goes up next to all the students who are trying to complete the same assignment in that usually 2-week period. And a teacher would go up. This one was my particular nightmare of a teacher. So he's sort of Sergeant Riker, except a very, very fey Sergeant Riker. And he would go up and just literally find everything wrong with it he could. And if he couldn't, then a fellow student was like a corporal, was asked to go up and find the best one and the worst one in class. And you didn't realize it then, but those fellow students would be your competition as well for those first jobs. Now, Harvey Thompson, the man shown here, now deceased, once gave me a 45-minute crit in the last semester of school and basically said, you don't really have what it takes. Oh. And I'm sure that other people have had this kind of what's a push in the back that'll say, I'll show that SOB. And I think for 20 years, maybe 25 years, while he may have even been dead at the time, that I was still muttering that under my breath as I did painting. And it's all from these wall crits that were, I think you could safely say, at times brutal. These are the kinds of work we did in school. We were learning at that time in the late 60s, acrylic painting and montages and using acrylics in bright, bright colors with bright shadows was sort of all the rage. And most of these that came out of my portfolio were designed so that if I went to San Francisco to try to work, I'd have a piece that was tuned to San Francisco. You learned very quickly that your market was what you should be showing, that they weren't going to be interested in something having to do with Chicago if you were trying to work in, say, Los Angeles. We did AF and VK, you may remember Chris did car ads for Pontiac in the 1960s, and they were beautiful things. Those two illustrators, Art Fitzpatrick, and I can't quite get the other guy's name, came to Art Center and showed off their work. And so all of us were influenced to do sort of a loose watercolor background coupled with a very tight gouache or opaque watercolor car. The only reason I include this, not that it's a great piece of pen and ink, but it is a pen and ink piece. And it turned out that I was pretty good with pen and ink. I had one teacher who was just absolutely the star of my life at the time, who had led me a whole book on British penmanship. And at one time, back at the turn of the century, there were artists in England who claimed that pen and ink was the finest medium you could work with because it was all abstract. The eye did the work for you instead of the colors of the paint. Anyway, this is one of those pieces, and surprisingly to me, the black and whites in my book, in my portfolio, were the first pieces to get me work. And the next piece will give you an idea why. Well, not quite an idea why, but this is sort of a little out of order, but we'll get to the other piece. Basically, after working in black and whites for a long time, I was able to get a New York rep who, for whatever reason on earth, saw some promise in my work. I'd been working for about 5 years by then. And from that period on, for 20 years, I was doing everything, book covers, ads, and many of the book covers were of damsels in distress. They call them bodice rippers. And they made me work harder on doing ruffles and but also art directing models to fit into this genre. And this is one of many, many ones. This is the most garish, I think, and that's why I chose for you to show it. Somewhere along the line in about 1982, things started to swing around from doing montage work to doing straight scenes, which most people by that time couldn't do. But hearkening back to that one picture in Art Center where our teacher would design a scene for us and light it and tell us how lighting worked. Well, those kinds of things came in handy when everything started to change. Also, by that time, people were imitating J.C. Leyendecker. Occasionally, someone would come along and try to do a Dean Cornwell or a Norman Rockwell. And those people were starting to get the same sort of work I was starting to get. This was for a Reader's Digest story. I don't want to pat myself too much on the back, but I was trained so well in a classic style of illustration that it's ironic in a way that I was probably the very end of that whole line of work. Saturday Evening Post folded, McCall's folded, all the big magazines that had featured fictional stories for men and women, they were gone and are now definitely gone. But I got to do a few pieces that sort of fit with that whole genre of work. this was another Reader's Digest scene. Again, these aren't specifically great illustrations, but they sort of show the influence of people who went before me and the kind of design things they worked with. When I first got out of school, I had a tough crit from an illustrator by the name of Tom Watson. I don't know where he is now, but he was nice enough to spend some time with me, and he looked over the 20 or 25 pieces I had. He said, you know, you render well and your color's okay, but your composition just isn't very good. Oh. And the example he showed me was work by, I'm going to say Degas, but I might be wrong on it, called the Absinthe Drinker. And it's basically, you know, the piece is tables that go into a forlorn looking woman who's holding a glass of absinthe in what looks like a Paris bar. And he pointed out the way things moved into this scene, and that was one of the key talks that many people gave me the benefit of their experience that helped me along at different stages. Somebody also said, just watch Citizen Kane once, and you'll learn about composition. And that's true too. A good director, Michael Curtiz, John Ford, if you look at some of the pieces they put together that are just really beautifully designed, then that can give an artist some idea of what he should be trying for. National Park Series, we're getting more into scenes that required research in terms of background, uniforms, things like that. I think I did 6 of these for Yellowstone. And this one just shows I had to get a guy, I had to put him on a horse. Luckily, this man owned that horse, and he was more than willing to be immortalized in this particular painting. Now, this, if you could take this one and put it
back there. I'm sorry about that. I tried to put it back before, but I messed up that one too.
When those black and white sketches got me into doing small work for small companies, and eventually I sat next to a guy who was doing car ads at the time for Mazda, I think. And he showed me, in a way, how to put together a black and white car ad. And it was just propinquity that I was able to sit next to him for 3 or 4 months early on. And that one thing of learning how to do a black and white car, I think for 2 years, gave me a survival rate that I was able to at least hone this black and white skill without doing any color work at all. So my point was, back then, it's been sort of a slow step-by-step ladder, staircase, step-by-step staircase to get.
If I might say, it's in looking at the work that we had in the slide presentation, I can see you do a lot of black and white drawing compositional things, and you can see all that practice and experience from those things coming in to your composition, it seems. Anyway.
Well, some people worked with color comps. I think we saw a couple of them in the presentation last year. I find it, I'm actually stealing a whole series of techniques from Rockwell on Rockwell, a book on how Rockwell did his work in 1949 and 50. But ideally, although not always, you try to work out all the problems in your painting, in a complex painting, before you lay down the whole thing on a piece of canvas. Yeah. And things always change. Size does make a difference in painting. But ideally, most of what has to happen happens in those formative periods of doing sketching and working them up to a final line drawing. This is also good for the art director or whoever's looking over the project, because he doesn't want to see the first piece that comes out of the gun. He wants to see a whole progression that he can either show an editor or show himself or improve upon as you do it. The reason we're up to this one now is because we're out of the, theoretically, the pieces that I did through my rep in New York. And at a certain stage in my life, if you echo back to Dawn Patrol, I had wanted and firmly believed in the idea that I could make a living like Western artists were doing, but I could do it with the field that interested me most, which was World War I aviation. And this is obviously a takeoff on a Rockwell, but it's a pretty good one. And it took a while to organize the uniforms and the backgrounds and the people so that as a puzzle, you gather these pieces. They're not all there in the studio at one time like Rockwell could do. This might have taken, well, I'll tell you, the chickens are from France, the house is from a farmhouse in Wisconsin, the girl is a model from Seattle Models Guild, the men are from a choral group at my church at the time, and then the guy in the doorway is my best friend, Jay Brose. And to put all those things together took, it's like a movie, a year in the making, but certainly not working all the time on it.
Wow.
And finally getting, not full circle, but almost True Magazine, and it getting us into the period of military work. This piece done recently for the Pritzker Library is a good example of that combination of things. An historical illustration done with World War I stuff, and working on one of the first, I think this older gentleman, he was 67 when he led his troops over the top. And I think he got a Silver Star. He didn't get a congressional. He may have had his head examined, but he was a colonel and he decided he was going to do this. And during the last month of the war, where most American casualties happened, this guy took his men over the top.
Wow.
Oh, I did want to say one last thing about that piece. That in 1958, I think, it could have been 68. Time Life did a beautiful series on World War I on the 50th anniversary of it. And it was wide and vast and big and had details and lasted 4 or 5 issues, I think. They had done the same with the Civil War. And I had always thought, or bemoaned the fact that I would probably be too old to do it when somebody did it again in 2018. Well, nobody did it again. 2018. This is the only illustration, pure trench warfare, that I did for World War I.
Right. With that said, before we transition into the next set of slides, if we could, I'd like to take a pause and do some live Q&A, and then we can take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll get back into the career and then go into the contemporary stuff you've been working on.
I hope I'm up to it.
Oh, sure. Well, I'm sure you are, sir. All right, get ready for the questions. All right. Anybody got any good questions for Mr. Dietz? I've got one to start it off. Jim, when did you first consider yourself an artist?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. I'm still working on that. Well, let me elaborate. I'm kind of an artist illustrator, and the perception of who I am and how serious my work is changes sort of daily.
Aha. Good deal.
I'm just lucky to be able to paint a picture and have it come out as I imagine it. That's not exactly the definition of an artist, but it is the definition of a craftsman, and that's probably what I am.
So there was never, you mentioned the one professor who said your work, you never quite would have it. So you spent years sort of overcoming that. And finally there was a day when you said, you know what, I got it. Was it earlier or later?
You know, as you get older, you achieve a little bit of a wider wisdom. That particular teacher, who I still hate fervently, although he has since gone away, was probably a good object lesson, because most art directors are far more like him than your best teacher who took you under his wing and said, you're going to be really good. That one teacher, when he said that, set me off on such a toot that at one point somebody finally asked me around the year 2000, he said, shouldn't you kind of give up on that? And I said, yeah, that wouldn't be such a bad idea. But my whole goal during the first graduation was just to live through the first 2 years. It's a little like living through boot camp. If you can do that, then, well, you got a better chance to survive the next 6 months after that. And I bet you everybody here who has an illustration background has grappled with the question, is it art or is it illustration? And that is for a whole other discussion.
That was actually my next very question. Do you consider yourself an artist or an illustrator? And what distinction is there, if any?
An illustrator works for the moment. He is usually working on a deadline, and he may have his own ideas on it, or it may be generated by an art director. And if he's lucky and if he's skilled, he puts more into that particular artwork that makes it still live after a few years. The illustrator isn't particularly interested in depth, but is interested in having a thing that conveys an instant message. An artist, if I understand correctly, is, especially in modern art, is interested in conveying a feeling, generating a feeling in the person looking at the art, and in some way have a new effect on each single person who sees it. It may be very similar. When you're looking at a Wyeth, perhaps everybody has a similar sort of reaction. But if you're looking at a Picasso, everybody sees it in a different way. And because they do that, it has a more lasting impact if it's well done or the critics like it. And that, in a very simple way, is sort of my take on art and illustration.
Good deal. Yeah, I personally think if you have to try to make a distinction, you suddenly alienate the vast majority of art history as somehow different or other than artistic creativity.
All right, we're getting far afield now, but art history changed with World War I. In other words, up to World War I, your take on what great art was is similar to mine. I love the French Academy painters, but after World War I, like so many other things, it was blown apart. And the idea of making heroic figures for artwork became second to showing different sorts of emotions for both the artist and the viewer. Again, a quick take.
Good deal. So you mentioned Rockwell on Rockwell, and so how impactful was that book? You said you're kind of, everybody steals though, by the way, borrows.
Nearly everything I've done, you could say even at Art Center, is derivative of something. And artist by the name of Jimmy Bama was one who I wanted to emulate along with the others I mentioned, and was doing so. Rockwell, just that one book encapsulated what I was already doing, but it also sort of slapped me on the back for knowing how to do that. It's a book I recommend to almost everybody that comes up to me and says, how did you do that? But the truth is, Chris, like you and like most of the people who are listening, it's like 10,000 hours. There are some people who are just gifted, and they have the ability right out of the gun to be able to do wonderful work that is bought and purchased by other people. There are other people that, like me, who have to struggle for years and years and years to polish and perfect and also learn to solve puzzles that art directors might give them, and communicate on a first level with somebody who can help them or pose for them or sell for them. They're all parts of what make, as my dad used to say, a professional. He learns, or she learns, like Robert Preston said, he learns the territory. That's from The Music Man, but close enough to art.
All right, very well said. Well, we're going to go into the second part of the presentation, which we'll talk about more how you transitioned into your current oeuvre, your current body of work. All right, everybody, we're back again with Jim Dietz in the slideshow presentation talking about his career. Now, Jim, I understand that you transitioned into a more military career, full-time military subject matter. How did that take place?
Well, it was a very, very slow translation. Anyway, it was slow. I was given at some stage in the late 1970s the opportunity to do military histories. I'd asked my rep in New York, Barbara Gordon, who was a big deal rep at the time, said, I'm getting really tired of doing these women getting their bodices ripped off. Is there some way we can do anything that was more along lines? And you have to cast that all the way back to what the inspiration were, comic books and war movies and all the stuff I drew when I was a kid. So it's sort of coming full circle. Well, they did have a series of books that were being reprints mostly from the old Ballantine series. And they weren't paying as much as the more romantic book covers of that time. But they did have a lot of interest to me and more fun to do, certainly. So I got into doing numerous book covers that were glorified examples of combat. This one happened to be Tarawa, which Chris and I have talked about already once upon a time. And they gave me a lot of experience of going from throwing everything into a painting to editing it back to a more or less complex situation that would tell the same story. This is a Marine howitzer in the Pacific. And the howitzer itself and some of the people around it, I repose, but I think the howitzer itself is based on a picture from the South Pacific. So that I was able to, these paintings had to be done within a week or 2 weeks.
Wow.
They were really fast. And it was at a time when I was a much faster painter too.
Oh, really?
Now this is one that isn't Marine at all, but it is an indication of seeing more and more of illustrations from the 1930s that I was really looking at hard. The New York Society of Illustrators published several really good compendiums of American illustration. And I was looking at those pretty hard. I was also depressed most of the time because I could see the ability that went into doing a really good illustration. This one, which is a very fictional look at the July 20th plot, involved almost everybody I knew posing as a model. So it was sort of the heyday of those book covers. Finally, this was the first military paid for, printed, sold to the 82nd Airborne Museum painting I did, and it was Sicily. And those sharp-eyed observers will see that it owes a lot to classic friezes of the time, not of the time, but over time. It's a very dramatic lighting and compositional painting that owes a lot to the Marine Corps Memorial of Iwo Jima. It's a group of soldiers patterned into a triangle with our leader pointing the way forward after the aerial drop on Sicily in '43. At that time, people in the military or people that frequented military art were buying almost exclusively Civil War paintings, mostly by Mort Kunstler, but there was a whole bunch of other artists that were involved in doing quite well. And I really didn't ever want to do Civil War if I could avoid it. Too many buttons and stripes and too many ways to go all wrong with somebody being able to call you on a strap on a rifle that wasn't right. And as you know, I'm from the West Coast, there was no way I was going to go to the big Civil War reenactments that the other artists that I knew just pretty much inhabited and got models and work from doing that. So I had sort of said, I won't do that. And I will do anything after that. I'll do World War I or something. Now, these are three quick pictures that are obviously self-serving. When I do use reenactors, they're a group that I really love to work with. They're down in Los Angeles, and they're a number of people who've done World War II reenactments, parades, that sort of thing. But the guy I deal with most is a man by the name of Juan Gonzalez, who is just, he's an angel. He did all the uniforms and all the cigarette packs, all the K rations. His company did them for Saving Private Ryan. So they know how to get everything right. And if I make one misstep, somebody will say, well, that's the wrong thing. Some people, as you well know, will come up and say, Jim, I don't know, you're just a genius at doing these things. You get all this stuff right. And I go, not so much me, but the people I work with do know how to do the job. The guy over on the right there is Quay. He's an ex-Marine. And that guy knows everything. He is so great to work with. And we'll see another part of his example of his helping me out a little later.
Jim, how do you do it? That's what people are wanting to know, and that's why we brought you here.
I do it pretty much the same way artists have done it. I use a Renaissance method, which is sketch it out, draw it out, get it right, do the underpainting. It's nothing new. I mentioned this before. If you haven't got the book Rockwell and Rockwell, it's an excellent place to really begin. This one was one of my favorite paintings, and I want to stay on this sketch for a moment. In 2008, I was given the opportunity to do an insertion into Iraq. This was after the surge had begun, so I was more or less safe. And they flew me into about 4 different places to do a painting at each place for a different unit. And it wasn't like the guys at the symposium last year who really had a tough job. They also an immersive one when they would stay at a place for a week or 2 or 3, getting to know the people there and sketching out what they would do later. Mine were mostly come in, let's set up what we're going to do. We want your advice. I do a very quick, sort of almost stick figure thing on paper. And then we'd go out and see if we could do it. Now, I came in at about midnight one night in a Black Hawk and was escorted by the sergeant major to meet the lieutenant colonel. He goes, buzzard. I have to go back and check. And he said, well, this is what we're thinking. And he said, I would like to give you over to the sergeant major and he'll give you his idea. His idea was perfect. I mean, I didn't even have to think about it. He said, we would like to see something that transitions our men today to their antecedents, ancestors, maybe, in World War II. And I said, well, I sort of been thinking about an idea of doing this anyway. And it comes from kind of Twilight Zone kind of thing, and also old war movies too, I suppose. So I said, what would happen if we did this? And I sketched out the idea. And you'll see in pencil, it's harder to see, the guys over on the right are all WW2 guys. And the people walking into the scene are current. And the people walking out of the scene are current too. But the idea of showing some of the suffering of war without as much glorification was all part of this, so that later on, 100 years from now, it would speak more of what happens after a battle than what the battle looks like or beforehand. So we had a very dark scene and a dark theme. And the centerpiece of it is a wounded guy getting a field dressing, and the rest are looking at it. And if you look at Norman Rockwell pieces, you'll see that basically I was ripping off 4 ideas at once. Mm-hmm. But if we move along to the next image, you'll see the process, and I really wanted to do a good job on this. So I started by drawing vehicles, the vehicle we had, seeing how much of it would show, and variations on what the people look like in the foreground, what fit best, what overlapped most. Generally in paintings, I try to overlap wheels and circular objects, try not to do too many tangents in them, because circles have a subtle but real targeting for the eye. And when you can cut them out, especially real circles like this one is, it tends to avoid that.
Well, if I may, also these have a, you can go on. These have a sort of Leyendecker study quality. How, if you've seen some of his on illustration board, he'd have full color practice things, and he'd have variations in a figure or a hand or a face, and these kind of remind me of that.
A lot of times I'll get to even to a finished thing, and we were once told, Chris, and this fits into what you just said, that you'll see an amateur, and in aviation art you see it a lot, that the figures in it will always be turned away, their hands will always be in front of them in the box. When I first got out of art school, the crits that I got in going to McDonnell Douglas or Lockheed, where I was trying to find work, was the first thing they'd see is a bad hand. And our teachers would say that you concentrate mostly on the face, then the hands, and then everything else after that. So that if a hand looks awkward, or if anything looks awkward in a painting, it can't stay.
Yeah.
And a lot of these things are worked out in sketches like this. So here's a simpler version of that first sketch you saw. It combines all of the elements of the contemporary soldiers in it.
Now, you're adding parts, tracing paper elements, or are you physically, literally moving as if you would do it today on a computer, or you just sort of click and drag? Are you sort of moving around things?
A little of both. In most of these paintings, I'm doing these sketches for two reasons. Number one, I was fascinated by how they were coming out. And I wanted the best that I could do to show in the painting. The second one is an interesting one. And it speaks a little about where we are today. This was 2008 or 2009 when this was done. And I used to, at that time, participate in the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance art tent, which was 20 of the best automotive artists that there are, and then me. And usually the artwork is of classic cars, classic scenes with classic cars, maybe contemporary, really elegant cars. But each artist has to do 4 or 5 paintings. And I proposed to the board, the group of artists that is, that in the following year, I would have liked to have done one scene. Go back for just a minute. And I would do one segment of our art tent, which is on the 18th hole of the Pebble Beach golf course, and do a full thing of how a painting was done for the military. Oh. Now, between you and me at that stage then, the Iraq War and the Afghan War were sort of in the background, but they were very real, and I'd just been there and it was very real to me. And although not a full-hearted supporter of it all, I was supportive of the men and women who were giving a lot of time and a lot of effort to getting it done. And I thought, what a great way to show credit. All these people who come into the art show pay about $300 a ticket, not into the art show, but into the concourse as it is. And wouldn't it be interesting to have them take a look at how the automobile, i.e. in this case a Humvee, is being used overseas. Yeah. And so some of these sketches were done to complement that concept. One full board of about 8 by 6 or something like that of all these, and then the finished painting, which was I think 32 by 72. I got all these done, and then the woman who heads the Pebble Beach show, which is all done for charity, when the idea was proposed to her, not by me, but by the president of the automotive art group, she said, "No, we don't want to have people reminded of that." Oh. No, I wonder what somebody would have said in 1944 if the same thing was proposed. It was I'm not going to say major disappointment. I knew it was a roll of the dice, but these sketches, which now I'm very happy and proud I did, they look pretty good to me.
I'd like one framed, that's for sure.
We're part of the idea that we could dedicate a little bit of time when people were drinking strawberry or drinking champagne and eating chocolate covered strawberries to thinking about the people who were overseas at that time in 110-degree heat, you know, living at Ali Al Salam, ready to be going into country. So anyway, that's my story about that.
That's the truth.
This was one of the guys on the left-hand side. And you can see we had all the uniforms and every stuff. The guys from Fort Lewis, which is just down the road, I was working on a special forces project for them. And I said, well, as long as we're working on that, would you mind standing in for 82nd? And they go, oh, wow, cool. And they did. It's always funny to see how enthusiastic people generally are to be involved in this.
Well, first of all, men are boys at heart, and that would be an ideal thing to dress.
I tell them, because you hit the nail right on the head with us. I said, now these are hardened soldiers, guys have been in combat and everything. And you know, occasionally they look at me like, you know, sort of a goofball. But I say, all I want you to do is pretend to be 13. That's it. If you can remember, if you got to play guns when you were 13 or something like that, or you'll make this all happen. Now, I've got to tell you one other story. 99.999% of the time, it works great. On this particular shoot, we had one guy, and I'm sure there's always one guy in 10, but he said it was like 105 out, so it was a hot day and it was taking a while. He said, I just don't want to do it. Oh. And I said to him, he said, well, you're under no obligation from me. I'm nobody. But, you know, you'll be in this painting. It'll be up on a wall for maybe 100 years or so. And he said, I'm just not going to do it.
Oh.
And, well, let's try to think of your time in the service or my time in real life. There's always somebody who's got an issue of something or another. And this guy was obviously angry. He was over there. and there's a scene in Pork Chop Hill where they send a press guy up to the front line, and Gregory Peck says, I just don't know what the hell they're thinking about back there, sending you up here. Well, that's sort of kind of the same sort of thing. Anyway, this is a finished painting. You could also, and you can see in here too, I think there's a German helmet over on the left-hand side. There's a few little clues that it's not as simple as you think it is. Yeah. This did not sell out. This was not a giant success of a painting. Did very well in the unit, but to me, it's one of my best. And these are all the guys that made it possible.
Nice. It's a win-win for everybody.
Kind of, yeah. It sure was a great experience. Now, this next one is in here just for fun. This combines, obviously, aviation, which I liked, and the Goonie Bird, which is probably, or the C-47, the Skytrain, one of the most, like the Jeep, the most important thing that America produced in some ways in World War II. And this had to be the jump in North Africa, not the prelude, but part of Operation Torch. The thing that this painting doesn't see is these guys had to be so anxious to get out of these airplanes that they would have done it without parachutes. They'd been on board all the way from England. Now, I don't know what the math is to get from England to North Africa in a C-47 at about 130 or 140 miles an hour, but it takes a ton of time. And unlike planes today, those airplanes would be going up and down, air pockets the whole way, especially when they, so everybody was probably sick, they were tired. They had to decide whether they were going to land the planes on an iffy airstrip or actually parachute in. It seems to me their colonel said, we came here to parachute and we're going to do it. So that's the story behind this painting. And there's a few sketches of how it was done. You can see the variety of rough sketches that went into this. It's not the first parachute painting done by anybody, but it was the first one done by me. And to get the views of the parachutists was always going to be problematic. You can go to the next one.
Wow.
And the next one. This is the one they chose. This is a line on canvas. So you can see the detail that the line work is involved in. And you don't see the preliminary sketch that went into this one, but there was one. This was the underpainting. So this is all done in raw umber. Rockwell said he liked to use Purple Lake, and I have tried that, but it always turns out pretty purpley. And I find that the raw umber works, especially on the dark side, and with a wash of a very light wash of blue-black can sometimes be all you need to do the shadows. And I think the final one will be the final painting. This is maybe this one is not quite done because the windows in the C-47s aren't quite indicated yet. And the guy in the foreground, he's all in transparent painting, even his face. Nothing has been opaqued in at this stage of the game. So I work back to front and left top to bottom right because it's oil paint. But the most important part on a painting, it's a little like playing the close game in tennis, is the stuff that supports the main action. Amateurs tend to dismiss backgrounds and center objects, the ones they're interested in, and do them first, and then eventually get to the background, which since they've done all the rivets on the airplane or the tank or whatever it is, they're not very interested in. Whereas this technique of working back to front gives the most fun things to do at the very end, so that it is as if, well, I was going to say something with a sexual context, but I won't. But if you're doing the stuff that backs up, that is the background to the scene, the stuff that a guy in the movies would have to work out so the actors look good, you do all that first. You do all the mind-numbing, boring details of 1,000 parachutes. And then finally, the last thing you get to after the airplanes are done, after the uniforms are done, you get to go to the face that is going to sell a painting. And this is all just one step away from that.
So we talked a little bit about puzzle solving, and it seems to me you were just mentioning that too, that's part of your job. It's almost like you're a director but you're literally almost putting a puzzle together visually.
It is like you're doing one scene from the middle of a sequence of things. You're combining, you're squashing time and adding width. So most of these long horizontals are like super panorama. They used to call it something panorama viewing in the 1950s when they were widening the screen and lessening the distance. These are scenes, again, of those guys down in LA. And when I called them to say, look, I'm coming down and we got to do this, they said, well, we can go out to MacArthur State Park, San Pedro, and we'll figure something out. Now, luckily, they're all 82nd guys. They all had all the gear, and not all of them had parachutes and everything, but they had everything else they needed. Juan Gonzalez, who, as I said, makes some of this stuff, brought all of that out. They had the right gloves, they had the right weapons, they had the right weapon holders, and I almost can't stop laughing when I think about it. They were trying to fling a rope over a branch in a tree so that they could string up all the guys that came out that day as parachute. Wow. And they finally got it over and they strung these guys up. And then if you go on to the next image, go back to the other image. This one, they started these people swinging. Everybody was laughing, and because San Pedro is an open park, the people would start gathering around, wondering what the devil was going on in this thing. And I have more pictures of paratroopers in flagrante coming out of airplanes than I'll ever need again. But it worked well, and the guy I mentioned before, Quay, he was the one who set the whole thing up. He figured out how to do it. He figured out how to make them swing back and forth, and only a few people were hurt. Now the next the next one is a lead in to The Long Track Home, which is a setup on homecoming from World War II. The painting was done for Command General Staff College, and they really didn't have an idea of what they wanted, but they wanted to celebrate the idea of people coming home. I think they thought that there were more people coming out of country at the time. And the one thing I thought of, and if you haven't seen it, it's a Preston Sturges film, and it's Hail the Conquering Hero. And it is a Marine Corps film, I think we can safely say, in many ways.
Yeah.
With Eddie Bracken. And have you seen it, Chris?
I have not, but I certainly am going to look it up now.
All right. William Demarest, who plays the old gunny. They find this poor guy who's been 4F'd. And he's been writing letters to his mother back home that he's a Marine Corps hero, like his Congressional Medal of Honor winner. And they find him in a bar in his cups, and they say, we're going to take you home and we're going to make you the hero. And he doesn't really know what is involved, but they get him on a train. And before he knows it, he's in front of this crowd at the train station, and he is not the hero they think he is. And it's a comedy, but done with a lot of heart. I can go on the next. This is what he comes into.
Wow.
And if you'll see in the next one, you'll see the costuming and everything. So I watched a lot of this, watched it several times. And the result was it inspired a Norman Rockwell kind of take on it. It took me a while to figure out the composition, but if you move along, these are the sketches that went into it. And this is somewhat of what you talked about, a sort of paste that's so complex for me and had to involve so many things. We went out to a train museum to shoot the right car. And this took an immense amount of, not one day of work, it took several weeks of getting different people to show up at different times. And go ahead. You'll see basically the simple version with just the train sort of sketched in and the figures as they appear to be. And if you look very closely, the girl on the far left, who has been substituted a little, is actually a screenshot of Ella Raines with a new body added to her. Her hat, 1944 vintage, and hairstyle is all that. And because it fits so well, and she didn't get screen credit for the painting, but she got in it from that old movie. And you can really, really, really see Norman Rockwell's kind of direction in all of this, from the conductor to the various poses of the people. Here's the finished line drawing that the people who were commissioning the painting saw. And these are different studies, again, that just to make me feel more comfortable. This was, to my way of thinking at the time, a very important painting for me to get right.
Oh, yeah.
Some of those vignettes would work great as just as vignettes without all the other things going on around them. This is, again, I think the final line drawing, maybe even on canvas. I think I had to straighten out one part. I was running into a little distortion in the windows up there. They're tilting down, and those all had to be redrawn when it got big. This is part of the underpainting, and again with raw umber, and you can see that it's 3/4 done, and I'm doing all the peripheral stuff. Obviously, the most important thing in my eye was the grouping of figures with the two little girls. There's a final underpainting. And the train still looks like it's slanting down, but maybe I corrected that later, or maybe I never did.
Oh, it is.
And I see there's a little bit of correction there. This is still, that last one was almost finished. You can see the floor isn't done yet, or the concrete. And a couple other faces are not done yet. And then the next slide is everything's done. And the next ones are clever, sort of the same thing. maybe there's more added there, newspaper headlines, things like that, that are just sort of the last gasp for artists. These are, thanks to Chris's work, good ideas of what the reference shoot was like.
Yeah, this is where I think, if I may, this is where you get, I was very inspired or struck by the Rockwellian nature of the method, because you've seen pictures of him in his studio in Vermont or Massachusetts, and he's kidding people, locals, to come and dress in all sorts of uniforms he's got.
Rockwell was kind of a right man at the right place. Number one, here's the way that was used. His wife could make costumes. He had a small town that he could make, that he was very famous in, and so everybody wanted to be a media darling for a week on Saturday Evening Post.
Yeah.
And he had a photographer that he could work with who could take up some of the slack in getting these complex things shot. You can see 3 different versions of the embrace. The models who didn't know each other, that's a tough thing to get to make look right. And the kick of the foot in the air is very 1940s.
Oh yeah. And they were married later on, by the way. No, just kidding.
Oh yeah. And these are guys from our church, I think, that I waylaid into doing this. It's hard for me. It may not look like it, but I was never trained to do any of this stuff. Photography, I didn't know how to do that. I didn't get any in art school. I didn't get any of the people handling skills that make this easy. I mean, some people just fall into this, and I make it look very natural when I'm doing it, but I get really uptight beforehand and then need a scotch afterhand to be able to juggle all these things. And part of it is also to remember the original idea, because this may be taking place over 2 or 3 weeks of having lighting set up and people conveniently coming in when they can. Whereas Rockwell could have it set up and done all in 1 day or 2 days. These are really hard to keep the fire stoked to get what is needed and wanted. And oh, the little girls weren't there at that time, so we shot them again. That's Patty, my wife, and our next door neighbor. That man on the right is an old airline pilot. And a Rockwell dog. Could be listening to the master's voice.
And Colonel Waterhouse too would like to put dogs in his work as well. There's a wonderful, ongoing thing about dogs in paintings.
Well, I found, and this is not giving away too much, that if you can put a dog in it, a woman can always like the painting, and their eyes are drawn to it. Patty will crucify me for saying this, but she knows it's true, that if you can add some humanity into a painting, if it's a possibility, and believe it or not, dogs are sort of that part of capability, have that capability, that it never hurts. This might be one of the best pro-America, we're in the fight now paintings that came out of 9/11 for me. I'm not saying for everyone, but at the time, I knew it had to echo something from 1942, but be contemporary. And I knew it would be complex. And it turned out to be, if you'll see the next one, that's another sketch for the same painting that wasn't used.
Oh.
And here's how the painting came out. Now, I've said this 1,000 times, but I really mean it. I owe a lot to people who've helped out when they had nothing to gain particularly for it. At the time, I had a really good reputation of doing work for the military and had a few friends who could tell me about other friends. And one of them was the command sergeant major down at Fort Lewis for the commander of Fort Lewis. And I kind of knew the commander of Fort Lewis. And I hate asking favors, but I had no way out on this. And I said, he gave the job to the command sergeant major to fill out the people we could use in it. It was everything from Army Rangers, Special Forces, to mechanized troops, to first aid, to fire. they all came up to the studio, including some guys from Bangor and the first female F-15 pilot who's in there. Anyway, a lot of people came by, and it took, I don't know, several weeks to do the reference shooting on everybody. The sergeant brought with him, the command sergeant major who's in here, brought a gigantic American flag, which we strung up out in the studio.
Oh.
And that's what the shot was for that. And I'm proud to say, and I'm vain enough to say, is the whole thing sold out in like an hour.
Oh, wow.
It was at Command General Staff College. And now it's one of the most valuable prints. But for me, although that's all nice, well and good, it is a good illustration of what I felt at the time and what I thought these guys deserved. It was also, my son was just going into serve as a second lieutenant in the Army, so I was very conscious of what I thought might lay ahead for him. And this you're familiar with too. This is a Marine Corps painting that was done for a third party who wanted to emphasize his support for the U.S. Marines. He's a publisher. And I had help from who you know, was he a gunnery sergeant, Tommy?
Yeah, we had, there's a couple of them. There's Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan, and then there's Gunny Williams, who runs the historical company.
So Williams.
Yeah, Gunny Williams was the...
And I called him, and he didn't know me from Adam, I don't think. And I said, look, I've been given your name, and I need this, this, and this. And I said, I need it all the way back to 1776, because this was going to be a 3-painting project originally.
Ah.
And he said, who the hell are you? And I go, well, look at my paintings, they're online. The nice thing is I have a good reputation. My reputation goes in front of me, and they know that people that are involved in paintings, I'm doing it. I'm not just jacking them around. There will be a painting done. And so in one day, he got everybody he could think of together, including serving Marines. And he made sure that I knew that I could not take a dress uniform to put on a model back home. He said, nobody's going to give up their uniform for that. You're going to have to pose somebody here who's actually the real deal. And we did. And I'm glad that that's the way it all worked out. And this is, you've just seen a couple of the sketches, and I think we're going to see the finish on this.
Now, interestingly enough, the officer there is Scott Yost, who works at the museum. And he was there a lieutenant colonel at the time, working on staff at the time. And he's back with us here working. So we have this in the hallway right near our offices.
I'm delighted. It's the only really Marine Corps painting I've done. I mean, I've done some aviation pieces that feature the Marines in World War II, but this is the hell-bent for leather painting. And the only short story I have to tell about this is before the symposium last year, I was grabbing something like fish and chips or something at the Globe and Laurel the night before. And I was sitting in the bar room, because if you're all by yourself, it's the most coziest place you can sit. And next to me came a table of, I don't know, 25-year-olds or so, not Marines, but 3 women and a guy, or 2 women. Anyway, a combination relatively compared to me, young people. And I sat there having my drink and eating my thing, and one of the women who was seated right next to me, she started to say, why are you here? And thinking I might be a Marine, which is not true. And I said, well, I'm involved in the symposium, and Art Symposium. And she asked a few more questions. And she said, so what do you do? And if you look out the door of the Globe and Laurel from the bar, that painting is, the print of that painting is right there. It was like 10 feet away from me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to be wordy about being an artist, which there's a tendency to be. All I had to do is go like this.
Why, that right there is what I do.
For 10 minutes, she just didn't believe me.
Yeah.
Because, but afterwards, I wasn't looking for company in particular, but afterwards they all left, and she came back and she said, I wanted to talk to you more about doing artwork. I've thought about it for a while. It ended up being a really nice evening. And I can say without a doubt that part of the reason I do the paintings I do, what I hope for them, is that the people, the soldiers and people who buy the painting, put it up on their wall, and it's a window, whether they're a man or a woman, into their service that allows them to be able to talk about where they've been and what they've done. That if that painting had not been there, might have taken them a little longer. So like if it's done, if it's accepted in the right way, it's a window into their service. And this service for many, many of men and women who have been involved has been a tough one. Lots of time away from the family. Hasn't been easy. And if they have something that when their son or daughter reaches 10 or 11 years old and they say, Dad, Mom, I know you went overseas. What were you doing? They might be able to come over to the painting and it might start a conversation. And like that conversation, that it was much more pleasant in the bar, it might lead to some deeper understanding between the two of them.
Excellent.
These last ones are generally takeoffs on that first call to color scene. They had me redo this every 5 or 6 years, and it involved just as much work. And eventually I couldn't do it anymore. I think I was asked last somewhere in the 2015 or so, and I said, I've done that so many times that I can't do it one more time. So that's a pretty good one, though. That was, I was really pleased with the way that came out, because that involved all portraits, which is,
yeah,
they're not easy for me, but they're the most fun.
Oh, good.
Now, this is our last slide, and the only reason our image. This combines just about everything we've talked about. It involves a composition involving a vehicle, a historical scene, several different stories going on Norman Rockwell-wise. Peace scene in the middle of war, which is rare. It could be from True Magazine, but it is a meeting of two different units in a small town in France, D-Day +8 or something like that. And it involves so many people that I was able to sort of Shanghai from the neighborhood or around the neighborhood, and from the people down in Los Angeles, from reenactors up here. It involved just about everybody. And it came out really good. I'll be the first to say it. And I was able to include one of my favorite weapons, which is an FG-42 that one guy is holding. Again, it has not been the best seller. Maybe I didn't do it for that reason. It did sell it, believe it or not, at that Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. It was the first painting that sold that evening, and there's only 1.5 days to sell. And it sold to a very nice couple. And I was delighted to have that happen, because I really put a lot of knowledge and a little bit of myself into it. So that's about it.
Good deal. Well, we're going to go now, once again, to a question and answer session. So everybody who's got a question, we'll address as many as we can. So once again, thank you very much.
More than welcome. Thank you for coming into my house and interviewing me this way.
All right, so thank you once again, Mr. Dietz. We've got some time for a few questions, just a couple of them. A good question from Elise McKelvey is, are there any art goals you haven't accomplished yet?
I think I answered it in chat, but yes and no. I'm better than I ever thought I was going to be, but I'm not as good as I ever wanted to be. In other words, the painters that I not emulate, but stand at their feet, I still stand at their feet. If it's Lady Butler doing Charge of the Light Brigade, if it's any of the illustrators that I admired from the 20s and 30s and 40s, I haven't gotten to that stage yet, and I probably never will. So it is a very much yes and no. I didn't have great plans for myself out of art school. And in some way, because of the, as Tennessee Williams would say, because of the kindness of strangers, I've done better than that. But I wouldn't say that I have the kind of confident ability to do anything I want. I still struggle over almost every painting I do.
What is the secret of your success? That sounds a little bit cliche of a question, but do you have anything, like you mentioned the kindness of strangers, but what secret do you have personally, artistically, for your success, do you think?
It's not so much a secret. It's people trusting me at different stages of my career to deliver the goods. And sometimes those same people helped me deliver the goods. So I had 10,000 hours of being paid to learn to do it. And it was, this sounds so self-serving, but sort of a 7-day-a-week job all the time. You look at Rockwell, he even worked harder than that. I've been looking over all the paintings over the past 50 years, and you know, I'm kind of proud of them. I think patience might be one thing. I could go through a few, but patience, because it takes the ability to work on a painting and do all the little details over and over and over and over again, and still have a look of spontaneity. And that certainly is part of my ability. I'm going to say one little story. I'll overtalk this a little. When I was still an illustrator, I was offered to do the V22 project for Boeing. It's about, I don't know, 1980 something. It was when the V22 was crashing a whole bunch. And I was flown down to Dallas to talk to the engineering department, who wanted to basically art direct the project. And by this time I'd learned to just shut my mouth until somebody had gone through what needed to be said, what they wanted, and not interrupt and just listen. And this gentleman, he said, well, in the first one we were doing a Marine Corps one, so it doesn't fit in Marine Corps. He said, we want V-22s to be landing in Norway, and we want on their air cap, we want Harriers, and above them we want F-18s. And then in the background, we want to see, I forget what kind of troop carrying helicopters there were in that. We want to see them disembarking troops. And then way in the background, we want to see LCTs and landing craft coming ashore. And I said, and where is this supposed to be? He says, in the mountains of Norway. I said, you know, I haven't learned very much in this business, but I've learned to keep things a little simpler than this. And he turned to me, straight faced, because he was an engineer. And they don't tend to have a very big artistic sense or sense of humor. He said, look, we've seen your work. You do busy stuff. We want busy. So just get to work. So I do very, very busy illustrations. I fill up the space. And my role models have been, we see Tom Lovell and a whole bunch of other people that are pretty darn good. And so whenever I start a job, I sort of say, you know, they had to go through this too.
Amen. Well, that'll end our question and answer. If you want to keep asking questions, we can do it in the chat. And so we're going to keep going.
Does anybody want to chat with me at all? Because
absolutely. We appreciate you coming here, sir.
I type very slowly. I'm almost tempted to have my wife do the typing for me. So ask simple questions. I'm a simple man.
Good deal, sir. Thank you for coming, sir.
Oh, geez. Thank you. Chris, Kelly, if this comes out at all well, I'll be surprised, but I thank you for your help in trying to make it so.
Oh, thank you, sir.